Okay, good afternoon everyone, or good evening, good morning for other persons in different time zones. Valentina, working for Humanity and Inclusion, Advocacy Officer based in Brussels. So the second part of the webinar will really be about presenting you a toolkit that we developed together with the Global Rehabilitation Alliance, and that we hope can support all of you who want to engage in national level advocacy for a resolution on rehabilitation, to really have some tools, ideas, directions, inspirations to carry out your advocacy. Maybe just as a very quick introduction, adding on what Christoph already explained very well, as you heard, there has been a number of activities, meetings, bilateral meetings in particular, that we organized with permanent missions in Geneva, knowing that they have a very specific role in representing the interest of their states towards the World Health Organization. But what we learned also by this process, by doing this process, is that the real decision making happens at the national level in capital cities. Therefore, we will for sure continue influencing as much as possible permanent missions and raising awareness about the need to have a resolution on rehabilitation. But in the end, the championship and leadership for this process can only be taken by countries where there is a strong political buy-in at the ministerial level. So that's why with this webinar we really wanted to reach out to as many GRA members as possible to encourage taking actions at the national level. Probably you already have contacts within the ministries of health or with other governmental officials that you could use to engage in conversations with your country representatives for this. We also know that in many countries there are national or regional offices of the World Health Organization, which of course could be an ally somehow for your advocacy, but this was a question that emerged this morning during the webinar. The real target are really governments and ministries of health in particular, and this is because the World Health Organization cannot actively push or advocate for a resolution. They need to be very cautious in making sure that any kind of process towards a resolution needs to be owned by states and needs to be put forward by states. So this is really the main target that we should have in mind in this advocacy. And among states, the states that can really play a key role are the states that sit in the WHO Executive Board, which is composed of 34 member states. There's a rotating system, so mandates last for 3 years. Not all mandates end at the same time. So we will share also the list of countries that currently sit in the executive board, and these are the countries that we need to focus on for our advocacy, because they are in the position of presenting a resolution, and they're also in the position of accepting or refusing a proposal for a resolution. So they're really the agenda setters for the World Health Assembly. This said, let's dig into the toolkit, and yes, and the toolkit will be composed of different documents. The first document is a template letter that should help you approach governmental officials. Maybe some of you already are familiar and already are used to be in touch with institutions. Maybe some others are less comfortable in doing so. So this template letter is really for you to have an idea. Of course, it can be translated, it can be adapted, and it's a Word document, so you can add your organization's logo and make any changes that you think make sense. But it's really for you to be able to reach out with good arguments for inviting them, first of all, to consider this topic, and also inviting them to set a meeting with you. Meeting in persons, we noticed that are, of course, the best way to convey messages, although also given the crisis, it might also be that we'll have more and more virtual meetings also with authorities. Next slide, please. Then we have developed other two documents that will help you when you already have a yes, let's meet, by the governmental officials to get ready for this meeting and to prepare at best for that. So there's a document with some talking points. Of course, we recognize that every meeting is different, that every meeting is really a conversation, so it also depends a lot on the kind of interactions that are going on with your interlocutors. And you also need really to make sure that there is the time for exchanges. It's just not the monologue of the advocate. So in this document, we really just have some ideas of a potential flow of discussions during a meeting with governmental officials. But maybe you can find there some inspirations, and of course, maybe things that are already quite obvious. Start by presenting who you are, what's the organization that you're representing. Don't forget in the end to set some sort of follow-up or try to get to some sort of commitment by your interlocutor. From the experience we had in the meetings we had in Geneva with different permanent missions of countries, there are some representatives that are very knowledgeable about rehabilitation, and with them we could really push further the conversation and get a bit more in depth in the details of a potential resolution. But with other representatives, including health attaché, we had to really start from a conversation on rehabilitation because they were not knowledgeable about the topic. So depending on the persons you will meet, try beforehand to gather some intelligence, some background information about the profile of this representative, so to prepare to adapt your meeting accordingly, and maybe dedicate more time to an introduction about rehabilitation at large before focusing on what we are here to ask for. And the second document, it's a document that provides some hints for a meeting with governmental officials, and it's divided into three parts. Let's say what to do, some suggestions about what to do before to prepare for the meeting, during the meeting itself, and after the meeting to ensure a follow-up and channel of communication is kept open with this official. When we look at these hints for the meetings document, there's also a specific attention on what I would call sensitive topics, recognizing that certain arguments that we want to use for the advocacy might function and work well in certain contexts, and might be less effective or even detrimental in other contexts. An example is the topic of universal health coverage, that for certain countries might be quite sensitive to put forward as the main objective. Or the topic of linking rehabilitation to the human right to health and well-being. We know that for certain countries, the human right approach is not the one that could work best. So it's really about knowing the context, which of course we recognize that you know much better because you are in the countries, and you know also the role and the place of rehabilitation in your public policies. So this knowledge is really critical to find use the good arguments, understand what angle can be highlighted, and what other arguments could be less important or less framed in your conversations.